By focusing on this one particular piece of the world, Christina Baker Kline has accomplished something grand. This is a gorgeous novel, both heartbreaking and life-affirming. Christina Baker Kline was born in Cambridge, England, raised in Cambridge, the American South, and in Maine. She is a graduate of Yale, Cambridge University, and the University of Virginia. She served as writer in residence at Fordham University, where she taught graduate and undergraduate creative writing and literature. She is the author of 6 novels, including Orphan Train, Bird in Hand, The Way We Should Be, Desire Lines, and Sweetwater. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Psychology Today. She lives near New York City and on the coast of Maine with her husband and 3 sons. And now I am extremely honored and privileged to introduce author Christina Baker Kline.
Hello, Philadelphia. I'm so thrilled to be here. I feel a little bit like a homecoming because I was here, as you know, for the one book, and it's such an honor to be back and with a new book this time. So what I'm going to do tonight is take you through a bit of the story of how this all happened, why I wrote this book, where it came from in my own life, and what it, I think, has come to represent in American culture. It's quick. It's about 35 minutes, and then I'll take questions, and I'm happy to sign some books after that. So anyway, thank you all for coming. We can turn the lights down if you can, and if you can't, it's all right too. These are bright. Unlike the slideshow I did for Orphan Train, these ones I think you'll be able to see no matter what. So this is the iconic painting Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. It was painted on the coast of Maine, Cushing, Maine, in 1948. If we could turn these ones down, it'd be great. But it's okay. I just can't quite see you. Thank you. That's perfect. Christina Olson, the woman in this photo, is a real person. In this painting, is a real person. She was 55 years old, actually, when this was painted. And Andrew Wyeth, who painted it, was 31 at the time. It was immediately sold to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City for $1,800. Today it's priceless, so it doesn't travel. It traveled once. It left there and went to the Brandywine many years ago, but it no longer does. And if you go to see it, or if any of you been to the Museum of Modern Art and seen it there, they're not quite sure what to do with it. It's hanging in a hallway. It doesn't quite fit their collections, but I'll talk more about that in a second. So my journey toward writing this book began perhaps here. This is 1970. I'm the girl with the white fluffy hair ties. My little sister is beside me, my parents behind. And Cynthia and I, my sister, still had an English accent. We moved to Maine this year. My parents are Southern. They're from North Carolina and Georgia. And they were young professors. My father had taken a job at the University of Maine. And when we got there, they decided that they were going to immerse themselves in all things Maine and try to give us some kind of sense of the culture of the place. So we read everything by Robert McCloskey. We read everything by E.B. White that was for children. We went to museums, and we went to the coast, and we did all kinds of adventures. And my father in particular was determined to kind of show us that world. So here I am on the ubiquitous shag rug from the 1970s, reading, as we always did in my family, lots of reading. And in fact, that reading led us to E.B. White's house one day. I just wrote an article about this for the New York Times. E.B. White lived about an hour and a half from us, and my father got it into his head after we'd been reading his stuff that he wanted to bring his daughters to meet him. So he sweet-talked a gas station attendant and found out where he lived, and we pulled up in front, and he just happened to be clipping the hedges. So this poor man, my father said, there are 4 young girls who've read every word you've written for children. And he very kindly came and chatted with us. You can see our rusty gold station wagon in the foreground. To this day, when I sort of crush pine needles between my fingers, I think of E.B. White showing us that when you do that, the smell is as strong as patchouli. It's a wonderful thing. We had a similar excursion to the house in the painting, Christina's World. This is that house in Cushing, Maine, just over an hour from where I grew up. And at the time, this house was not open to the public. So we were trespassing, for sure. And my father had us go, we went and sat on the lawn, the grass, in that same place where Christina Olson's portrait had been painted. In this picture, by the way, is my grandmother with the white hair, and I'll talk more about her in a second. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote this piece for the New York Times that was about my father's adventurousness. And the artist, I love this rendering. It doesn't look anything like our family, but it is kind of wonderful. And there we are, having a picnic down in the field at Christina's house. So my grandmother is the girl with the boat in her hair, and Christina Olson is beside her. Let's see, they told me I had let's see. Well, yes, that is Christina Olson. So they grew up, my grandmother and Christina Olson, within a few years of each other in very similar circumstances, both in rural farmhouses, actually white clapboard farmhouses, in the middle of nowhere. Both of them grew up without any amenities, no heat, running water, electricity, no lights, no indoor plumbing, of course. And both of them at an early age ended up taking care of their families. And furthermore, both of them had a polio-like illness when they were children, and they had trouble walking. So I'm Christina, as you know. My grandmother and my mother are also both named Christina. So my grandmother, Christina Crystal Curtis, actually identified quite strongly with the Christina who had been in that painting. When I was 8 years old, my father gave me this woodcut, which was painted by made by a Maine artist. We got it at the University of Maine craft show. And when we were chatting with her, she said that it was inspired by Christina's World. But my father bought it for me for my birthday because he thought that it reminded him of me, and there I am at that age. You can see a little bit of that. That picture is still on the wall in my home today, actually. And then finally, in my family, my mother, as I told you, was also named Christina, and a painter named Laura Tryon Jennings did this portrait of her. She is walking toward the house that my parents ended up buying on the coast of Maine. It was a totally derelict, ramshackle old house that was it was a fire sale for like $190,000 right on the water. And they ended up buying and restoring it, putting a wraparound porch on it, and it became the house that inspired the house in my novel Orphan Train, Vivian's home. But Laura Tryon Jennings, who is a Massachusetts painter, called this painting Christina's World. So my family wasn't the only one who had been influenced by this painting. And now I'm going to take you through some representations of this in popular culture, politics, social commentary, and fashion. So here we are with Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. There you can see Mary Poppins, Princess Leia. Moving on to television, here's Wile E. Coyote, Iron Man, Mr. Burns, and The Simpsons. They were always planting Easter eggs in their shows. And The Walking Dead. And then moving on to social commentary, here is Christina in an oil slick, an American, you can see the American flag on the upper right, an American-made oil slick. Factory setting. barren nuclear landscape, and a post-apocalyptic dystopia. So then there is political commentary, Chris Christie's world. The next one makes me a little sad, which may give away my political leanings, but the week of the presidential election, this cartoon appeared in the New York Post. And then a few weeks ago, my sister sent me this from an exhibit of Carrie Ann Weems' work. Carrie Ann Weems is an amazing photographer who often uses herself as a subject. She's African American, and clearly she's using this to make a comment about slavery. This was an exhibit in North Carolina. It's been used in fashion. This is Vogue magazine, Harper's Bazaar, another one in that series. Movies. Terrence Malick said that he had been quite influenced by Christina's World when he did Days of Heaven. Robert Zemeckis said that this scene was inspired by the painting in Forrest Gump. Some of you may have seen Outlander. The set designer and the clothing designer both said that they had drawn on Wyeth, and particularly this painting, and Westworld as well, the same thing, trying to get this character. She was modeled on the woman in Christina's World. It's been used in illustration, toast. There's a whole website, by the way, devoted to toast of famous artworks. Tattoos. There were many tattoos to choose from. I chose the nicest one, let me just say, the nicest one. And a birdhouse, inspired by that house. And of course, no collection of memes would be complete without cats. And I particularly like this one, with the mice in the sky, as you can see. So one interesting commonality that a lot of portrayals of this painting have in popular culture is that Christina, this figure, is universally seen as vulnerable. And here she is literally in the way of an oncoming train. Claire Danes did an off-Broadway ballet, which, by the way, is quite beautiful. You can see it on YouTube, in which she imagined what it would have been like to be Christina Olson, to have a degenerative muscular disease that steals your mobility over time, and she sort of showed how that unfolded in this ballet. And Cindy Sherman, the photographer artist, I went to this exhibit at MoMA a few years ago. This was, by the way, the size of an entire room, this photograph, and she imagined what it would look like if Christina Olson were to turn her head. Which, by the way, is one way of describing what my novel is. It's really the story of what it would look like if Christina Olson were to turn her head. And, you know, she's an enigma. She's a mystery because we really don't know anything about her. So people read all kinds of things into this portrait. And why is it so famous? Is it the figure? Is it that woman sitting in the grass? Is it the landscape? Andrew Wyeth famously said that after he finished Christina's World, he was tempted to paint her out. In other words, to erase her figure from the painting, because he felt that he had already done the work that was required to show her there. And in fact, he often did paintings that were in which objects were stand-ins for people. And there are a number of those that I'll show you from the house, where the Christina Olson house, where he would paint something, and he said that that was her brother Alvaro, or her grandmother, for example. And he did this all the time. So this is a painting called Wind from the Sea. It's one of my favorites of his. He painted it in a third-floor bedroom. These are curtains that Christina's grandmother, Tryphena, crocheted. And in this, he saw the sort of ghostly image of Tryphena here, blowing in the breeze. But what's fascinating to me is that when I started looking at sketches of this, as you can see, he sketched over the form of Christina. So, over the years, I came to think of this painting as a Rorschach test, a magic trick, a sleight of hand. The down-to-earth naturalism of Wyeth's paintings is deceptive, one critic said. In his work, all is not as it seems. Wyeth's paintings always have an undercurrent of wonder and mystery. He was fascinated with the darker aspects of human experience. I think you get glimpses of this in the dry as bones grasses, rendered in startlingly precise detail, the wreck of a house on a hill with a mysterious ladder leading to a second-story window, a lone piece of laundry floating like an apparition in the breeze. So, by the way, last week I was doing a radio tour, it's called. You sit on your couch from, in my case, 8 to 4, and you talk to about 40 different radio stations back to back. You can hear I'm a little bit hoarse still. But one of the radio hosts said, whenever I look at that painting, I think of that house in the movie Psycho, that house up on the hill. He said, I always wondered what was going on behind its windows. And I was fascinated by that because actually, Andrew Wyeth was greatly influenced by Edward Hopper, and especially this painting, which is called House by the Railroad. It also hangs at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was painted in 1925, and this house directly influenced Alfred Hitchcock in the Psycho house. So lots of people influencing each other. At first glance, this slim woman in the grass appears to be languidly relaxed, but a closer look reveals odd dissonances. Her arms are strangely thin. Her feet seem twisted. Perhaps she's older than she appears. She seems poised, alert, yearning toward the house, and yet hesitant. Is she afraid? Her face is turned from the viewer, and she appears to be gazing at a darkened window on the second floor. What does she see in its shadows? So after I finished writing my novel, Orphan Train, I began to look for another story that would engage my mind and heart as completely. I'd learned a great deal about early to mid-20th century American life as part of my research, and I thought it would be fruitful to linger there. I'd become particularly interested in rural life, how people got by, and what emotional tools they needed to survive hard times. As with Orphan Train, I like the idea of taking a historical moment of some significance and blending fiction and nonfiction, filling in the details, illuminating a story that had been obscured or neglected. So one day, several months after the novel came out, a writer friend remarked that she'd seen the painting at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and thought of me, and instantly I knew I'd found my subject. So for the next 2 years, I immersed myself in Christina's world. I sat in front of that painting for hours at MoMA, listening to the enthused, perturbed, intrigued, dismissive, passionate comments from readers all over the globe. My favorite one was from a Danish woman. She said, "It's just so creepy." I studied the work of all three famous artist Wyeths, N.C., Andrew's father, Andrew himself, and his son Jamie, to get a sense of their rich and complex family legacy. This book, Treasure Island, is perhaps one of N.C. Wyeth's most well-known works. It's still in print today with his beautiful illustrations. He also did illustrations for Saturday Evening Post and other books, and he was an artist as well, a fine artist. And if you go, as I'm sure many of you have, to the Brandywine, you'll see vivid representations of his work. I think there's nothing like seeing them in person. They're quite spectacular and very bright, by the way. When Andrew married Betsy, she convinced him to drain his canvases of color, thinking that he would be taken more seriously if his work wasn't as sort of as she said, cartoonish as his father's, and he did that. So this is Jamie's, a painting by Jamie Wyeth, and I think you can very much see the influence of his father in them. His work is varied, and again, if you've been to Brandywine, and you all here certainly are close to it, you can see that Jamie Wyeth's work is quite, over the years, has changed in many ways, but he's a beautiful representational painter as well. So in Maine, I became intimately familiar with the house, which became, not when we were trespassing, but later, part of the Farnsworth Museum, which has an entire building devoted to Wyeth art in addition to this place. This is in Cushing, Maine, mid-coast, Maine. I'll go back. I interviewed art historians and American historians, and I was lucky to get to know several tour guides from the Olson house who sent me articles and letters I never would have discovered on my own. I read biographies, autobiographies, obituaries, magazine and newspaper articles. I read more than I needed to about the Salem witch trials, which play a role in the family history, a major role. I collected postcards and even bought a print of Christina's World to hang on my wall. So here's what I discovered. Christina Olson, the woman in this painting, was descended on one side from the notorious chief magistrate of the Salem witch trials, and the only one who never recanted. He went to his death saying that those women had deserved to die, that they were witches. And in fact, the taint of association was so strong that 3 of the Hathorne brothers, his descendants, fled to Maine in the middle of winter, built 3 log cabins on this hill in Cushing, Maine. One of those cabins became the house in this painting. On another part of the family, one of the great nephews left Salem as well, changed the spelling of his name. His name was Nathaniel. He became Nathaniel Hawthorne. And he spent the rest of his life obsessively writing stories and books about people who hypocritically condemned others without looking at the perhaps evil in themselves. On the other side, Christina was descended from a Swedish peat farming clan. Her father had been a Swedish sailor who was stranded in ice. So I believe that she was uniquely poised to become an American symbol. Alone in a sea of dry grass, she is the archetypal individual against a backdrop of nature, fully present in the moment, and yet a haunting reminder of the immensity of time. As one curator said, the painting is more of a psychological landscape than a portrait, a portrayal of a state of mind rather than a place. Wyeth's style was forged in his father's studio as a child, developing in the 1930s and 40s under the intertwined influence of American regionalism and figurative surrealism. It's described today as a form of metaphoric realism, meaning that the ordinary is heightened to reveal qualities of fundamental human existence. Like Whistler's Mother, this is James Whistler, 1871, and American Gothic by Grant Wood, 1909, it shares traits that I think we think of as distinctly American. For example, rugged individualism and quiet strength, defiance in the face of obstacles, perseverance. Here's a painting by Thomas Eakins, who was an important realist, 19th century American realist. This is his 1883 painting, An Arcadian. He was, you must know, from Philadelphia, right? And many said that this painting was an inspiration, in fact, for Christina's World. So Christina Olson, who is this little girl in the middle between her parents and younger brothers, was born in this house, the house that's in the painting, which was white in her youth, and grew up on this barren hill in Cushing with 3 brothers in a house that their family had lived in for generations of ship captains in particular. Here she is at school as a young girl. This is Christina. Here's her younger brother, Alvaro, whom she lived with for her entire life. Christina was a brilliant student. When she was 12 years old, her school teacher, who's in this picture as well, right here, went to her father and said, this is the most brilliant student I've ever taught, and I would like to retire in a few years, and what I'd like to do is tutor her so that she could take over the schoolhouse when I'm ready, maybe when she's 16 or 17. I think she'd be ready to take over and teach the students. And her father said, absolutely not. He took her out of school, and for the rest of her life, she cooked 3 meals a day, did all the laundry, and took care of her family in that house on the hill. By all accounts, from an early age, Christina was an active and vibrant presence. Isn't she lovely? She had a lust for life, a fierce intelligence, and a determination not to be pitied, despite the degenerative disease that eventually stole her mobility. Here's Christina, and this is Walton Hall. If you've read my novel, or you're going to, it's not really giving anything away to tell you that this is the man who broke her heart. He was a cad from Harvard who summered in Maine, and for 4 years they had a relationship. And until Andrew Wyeth came into her life, he was sort of a symbol, I think, for her of what might have been. Though she was never, and here she is a number of years later, though she was never correctly diagnosed in her lifetime, this is her mother, and here's Christina. Neurologists now believe that she had a syndrome called Charcot-Marie-Tooth, a hereditary disorder that damages the nerves to the arms and legs. I attended the International Neurology Convention, and I got to hear a lecture by the physician who had diagnosed her with this, and he actually did a slideshow as well, a very different one, but it was completely fascinating. He wrote a sort of definitive piece for the Harvard Medical Journal about this, and no one knew what had happened to her, what the symptoms all led to, but what we now know about Charcot-Marie-Tooth is that there's actually no cure yet. So it was sort of tragic and sad what had happened to her, and the fact that no one ever knew what it was, but the truth is there's still no cure today. So even if you know what it is, there's the diagnosis is a little grim. I was lucky to find a documentary about a woman named Bernadette. The documentary is called Bernadette. She's now in her mid-30s, but her parents started filming her when she was born, and so I got to see the progression of Charcot-Marie-Tooth, and it helped me a lot as I was working on the figure of Christina and what it would have felt like for her to have it. By the way, the Charcot-Marie-Tooth, CMT it's called, the people who are involved in that and the head of that organization reached out to me this week, and I really hope to be able to sort of tell people about it. It affects, I think, 250,000 people in the United States, actually, and they feel that they're close to a cure. So Christina refused to use a wheelchair as she became increasingly immobilized, and she took to dragging herself around. Now, I am going to diagnose her father right now. No one has done this, but he was in a wheelchair for the last 15 years of his life, and he too had a degenerative ailment. He called it arthritis. But what I learned from this neurologist and also from this film is that Charcot-Marie-Tooth is often passed from the father to the daughter, interestingly. And in the film, Bernadette's father had it. So I think it's probably likely that Christina's father had it as well. So her life was difficult, and she had this brief moment with this man that she was very interested in, and things sort of fell apart. But eventually, Andrew Wyeth knocked on her door. So he was 22 when this photo was taken, and when he first showed up at her house, Betsy James, who became his wife, was 17 years old. The day that Betsy met Andy, as they all called him, Betsy summered in Maine, as did Andrew Wyeth, and he knocked on the door looking for her father, who was a painter. Her father was out sailing, but Betsy, very boldly, I think, for 1939, decided to go out in the car with Andrew Wyeth. She went on a trip with him. They drove around Cushing, And she brought him to visit Christina Olson. And she later said it had been something of a test because Christina Olson was in her 40s. She was fairly ornery. She was also very interesting, and Betsy adored her. Betsy had been going to visit her since she was 9. But she thought it would be interesting to see how this young man reacted. And he actually was immediately captivated. Not only that, Andrew Wyeth was captivated with the house right away. And in fact, the very first day that he went there with Betsy, he painted a picture of it. This is the first of 300 pictures, drawings, paintings that he did of the house, the environment, and the people in it. So as I mentioned, Betsy was 17. She and Andy were married 10 months later. They had this whirlwind courtship that started at the Olson house. So Andrew Wyeth began coming around almost daily. He lived in Port Clyde, right across the way. He would he would row over in his dory, get out on the shore, walk up that field that Christina was lying in, and he didn't even knock on the door. He just went in. He sort of took over. He had studios in various rooms. There were eggshells everywhere, egg yolks, old rags, turpentine. Christina and her brother Alvaro, who were the only ones who lived there at that point, were actually more than happy to welcome him. He was, by all accounts, movie star handsome, incredibly charming, larger than life in some ways, and yet he also, on a fundamental level, I believe, he related to Christina. He described himself as having been raised like a veal. His father did not allow him to go to school. His father schooled him in the studio. His father raised him in his own studio, taught him how to paint, tossed the Greek tragedies at him, and there was a little bit of book learning, but essentially he didn't have friends his own age. He was kept out of the mainstream of other children, and he said he was raised feeling a bit like a freak and a misfit, and that he always related to that in other people. Furthermore, Andrew Wyeth had an illness as a child that also affected his balance and his walk. He lived in a great deal of pain. One leg was shorter than the other. He had hip problems, so he had this sort of strange gait. And I think he related to Christina on that level as well. So another wonderful thing about Andrew Wyeth is that he's so eloquent. He died. He's 2009, but he was so eloquent. He, unlike many painters, he could articulate and wanted to articulate what he was thinking and feeling about what he painted. So here's what he said about the house. The world of New England, he said, is in that house, spidery, like crackling skeletons rotting in the attic, dry bones. It's like a tombstone to sailors lost at sea, the Olson ancestor who fell from the yardarm of a square rigger and was never found. It's the doorway of the sea to me, he said, of mussels and clams and sea monsters and whales. There's a haunting feeling there of people coming back to a place. And you can see, I think, the great love he had for it when you see how he painted it. So now I'm going to show you a series of pictures that I took, and there were a few by other people, of the house, and then his rendering of them. So this is the front hallway. Here's Alvaro chatting with Andy in the front hall. And here's Andy's rendering of Alvaro sitting in that same spot. This is one of the upstairs rooms that Andrew Wyeth used as his studio. There were several. Here's his rendering of that view. The Glenwood Range, this figures prominently in my novel. It was the source of heat and also, of course, of 3 meals a day for that family, and Christina spent a lot of time in the kitchen. Here's Andrew's rendering of that. So Christina's grandmother, Tryphena, believed that the witches from Salem were still in their lives, that the curse from the woman on the scaffold saying the family of John Hathorne would always be haunted by the ghosts, that they would never leave, was true. And so she kept this blue door between the shed and the kitchen open so that the witches could come and go. And here's Andrew Wyeth's rendering of that. Christina's brother Alvaro loved the sea. He had a lobster boat that he was obsessed with. He had a dory that he went out in almost daily, and it was his great joy. But when their father was afflicted and her mother was already ill, her father went to Alvaro and said, "You've got to stop. You can't do it anymore. You have to take over the farm. You can't fish every day." Alvaro was so sad and bereft about it that he put his dory in the attic of the shed, way up high, because he said it was too painful to be reminded of what he had once loved. And sometimes Christina would find him sleeping underneath it. And this is Andrew Wyeth's picture of that. And here are Christina's beloved geraniums. If you go to the house today, you'll see them. They flourished all year round. Here's an outside picture. And here is Christina, if you can see her, just through the window. So in time, Wyeth began incorporating Christina into his paintings. For more than 30 years, she was his muse and inspiration. What interested me about her, he said, is that she'd come in at odd places, odd times. The great English painter John Constable used to say that you never have to add life to a scene. For if you sit quietly and wait, life will come. Sort of an accident in the right spot. That happened to me all the time, Wyeth said. Happened all the time with Christina. So look at the doorknob right here. And see the doorknob in that painting? This was one of the early portraits of Christina by Andrew Wyeth. And this is one of the late ones. Quick of wit and sharp of tongue, Christina was a force to be reckoned with. Later in life, with her straw-like hair and her long nose, her quote-unquote spinsterhood and independent nature, she was rumored among some of the townspeople of Cushing to be a witch herself. Andrew Wyeth variously called her a witch and a queen and the face of Maine. So here they are together. So I think they shared more than simply some of those physical attributes and the fact that they'd been kept out of school. Both embraced austerity, but craved beauty. So when Andrew Wyeth's wife, Betsy, was pregnant with their second child, they had one baby and they were pregnant with another, they lived in a horse barn in 2 stalls. And she wanted to move into a cottage. And Andrew came over to the house and was stomping around and said, "Betsy is so damn bourgeois. I can't believe she cares. She's so materialistic that she wants to live in a house." And Christina, to her credit, said, I don't think it means that she's bourgeois, that she doesn't want to live in 2 horse stalls in a barn. But he eschewed his father's conventional materialism as he saw it. He had grown up in a fancy home with lots of cars. His father had multiple homes, and he felt in a way that his father, NC, had sold out, and he wanted to be a serious artist. And he said he was drawn to every cracked, broken, and faded thing. That was what interested him. So like Christina, I think he was happy in a place that was sort of in disrepair. So both were curious about other people, and yet pathologically private, perversely independent, and yet reliant on others to take care of their basic needs. Wyeth on his wife Betsy, and Christina on Alvaro. Look at how he's looking at her in this one. There was a very strange connection, Wyeth said, one of those odd collisions that happen. We were a little alike. I was an unhealthy child who was kept at home. So there was an unsaid feeling between us that was wonderful, an utter naturalness. We'd sit for hours and not say a word, and then she'd say something and I'd answer her. A reporter once asked her what we talked about. She said, "Nothing foolish." I love that. Isn't that great? Nothing foolish. So anyway, all of this led to his masterpiece in 1948. And here's what he said about that. "My memory can be more of a reality than the thing itself. I kept thinking about the day I would paint Christina in her pink dress. He had seen her, by the way, getting ready for her beloved nephew, John, her favorite nephew's wedding, where she had had this pink dress made. Like a faded lobster shell I might find on a beach, crumpled. I kept building her in my mind, a living being there on a hill whose grass was really growing. Someday, I knew she was going to be buried under it. Soon her figure was actually going to crawl across the hill in my picture toward the dry tinderbox of a house at the top. I felt the loneliness of that figure, he said, perhaps the same that I felt myself as a kid. It was as much my experience as hers. I worked on that hill for a couple of months, that grass, building up the ground to make it come towards you, a surge of earth, like the whole planet. When it came time to lay Christina's figure against the planet I'd created for her all those weeks, I put this pink tone on her shoulder, and it almost blew me across the room. So in becoming an artist's muse, a seemingly passive role, Christina finally achieved the autonomy and purpose that she had craved for her entire life. Instinctively, I believe, Wyeth managed to get at the core of herself. In the painting, she is paradoxically singular and representative. She is exposed and yet enigmatic. She's hardy and vulnerable. She is solitary, but surrounded by the ghosts of her past. Like the house, like the landscape, she perseveres. As an embodiment of the strength of the human character, I believe she is pulsating, vibrating, immortal. So I actually just realized I don't have a copy of my book in front of me. Does anyone have it? Can I borrow yours? Incredible, and I want to move in with them because they're so lovely, and they are such a huge part, the biggest part, I would say, of the One Book, One Philadelphia program, which I felt honored to be part of. Okay, so I'm going to read you one page, and then we'll move on. We'll have questions if you have any. This is the prologue. Later, he told me he'd been afraid to show me the painting, which, by the way, was true. He had been afraid. He thought I wouldn't like the way he portrayed me, dragging myself across the field, fingers clutching dirt, my legs twisted behind. The arid moonscape of wheatgrass and timothy, that dilapidated house in the distance, looming up like a secret that won't stay hidden. Faraway windows, opaque, unreadable, ruts in the spiky grass made by an invisible vehicle leading nowhere, dishwater sky. People think the painting is a portrait, but it isn't, not really. He wasn't even in the field. He conjured it from a room in the house, an entirely different angle. He removed rocks and trees and outbuildings. The scale of the barn is all wrong. And I am not that frail young thing, but a middle-aged woman. It's not my body, really, or even my head. He did get one thing right, sometimes a sanctuary, sometimes a prison. That house on the hill has always been my home. I've spent my life yearning toward it, wanting to escape it, paralyzed by its hold on me. There are many ways to be crippled, I've learned over the years, many forms of paralysis. My ancestors fled to Maine from Salem, but like anyone who tries to run away from the past, they brought it with them. Something inexorable seeds itself in the place of your origin. You can never escape the bonds of family history, no matter how far you travel. And the skeleton of a house can carry in its bones the marrow of all that came before. Who are you, Christina Olson? He asked me once. Well, nobody had ever asked me that. I had to think about it for a while. If you really want to know me, I said, we'll have to start with the witches, and then the drowned boys, the shells from distant lands, a whole room full of them, the Swedish sailor marooned in ice. I'll need to tell you about the false smiles of the Harvard man and the hand-wringing of those brilliant Boston doctors, the dory in the haymow and the wheelchair in the sea. And eventually, though neither of us knew it yet, we'd end up here, in this place, within and without the world of the painting. Thank you.
Why did you choose not to put Christina in the picture on the book?
So the Wyeth Foundation gave us permission to use the painting inside the book, but we couldn't use it on the cover. And to me, any attempt that we made to put a figure on the cover felt like ridiculous. It just looked silly. I was at an event, and there was a man there with his lady friend, and he came up to me and said, before it started, he said, did you know there's an artist named Andrew Wyeth that this cover resembles? I was like, yeah, thank you, I did know that. We sort of tried to get a bit of the feeling. It's actually, I like the cover, but it's, the next printing that we do will be a sort of lighter wash, a little bit more like the painting. It's a bit dark in my view, but anyway, we sort of tried to get the feeling of it without copying it. Yeah.
I would just start by saying I was really impressed with your ability to get in touch with negative emotions that people experience. I don't know how you did that. But,
did you you've read it already?
I did.
Yeah, thank you.
Did. One of my favorites.
Thank you.
But an important part of the book, I was wondering how you picked butterscotch as the candy, if you had a connection that is kind of important in the book.
So in the book, butterscotch is sort of a Madeleine, like a Proust-like emotion is evoked when Christina is used to Walton Hall kind of clicking butterscotch between his teeth, and then later Andrew Wyeth does it, and it releases a flood of memory and emotion that enables her to kind of process what had happened to her with him. And so I was doing research into the period, and butterscotch candies then were so popular. They were hard candies. It was just something that came up several times, and I know the strong flavor and the sort of many of us may have actually emotional memories when you have a butterscotch candy now. If it may bring up something from childhood, and it sort of did that for me, so I thought it might be useful in the book that way. Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet, but I'm wondering if you were aware of any other books about paintings as you were writing yours.
There are some amazing ones. Obviously, the Goldfinch. I just did a list for Salon or someone, I can't remember, of 5 books about paintings that I thought were really interesting. There are quite a few. Obviously, Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier is one of them. Susan Vreeland wrote The Girl in Hyacinth Blue. I've already mentioned the Goldfinch. There are a lot, and as I was starting to put a list together, I realized that I've read a bunch of them and had kind of forgotten their influence on me in different ways. But I've always been visually influenced, and when I was working on Orphan Train, I had an idea board. I think I talked about this when I came and spoke here, that had photographs and all kinds of other things on it, but pictures of the children who were who rode on the orphan trains and what their lives were like, and pictures of the village in Ireland where my character was from. I've always liked writing to visual images, and so this was sort of a natural to take on a painting like this. And what was interesting to me about the process is that when I started it, I sort of had this horrible feeling that I was going to get thoroughly sick of Wyeth, and especially of this painting. Like, how much can you look at this picture? But it was, when I say I feel that it was a Rorschach test or a magic trick or a sleight of hand, I really mean that. I could look at it I think I've been completely hypnotized, because I love this painting, and I have only grown to like it more and to see more in it the more time I spent with it. And particularly the real painting at the museum, going and standing in front of it and seeing what went into it. And the way that Wyeth wove magic into his canvases, it wasn't realism. I mean, so Wyeth was very famous in his lifetime, and in the mid to late 60s, he completely fell out of favor and was, in fact, shunned from the establishment. Essentially, the art world thought that he was a total hack, a conservative, even a reactionary. With the rise of pop art and minimalism and abstract art, his star fell very far. In fact, his obituary in the New York Times by Michael Kimmelman was pretty damning when you read it. But his reputation is being rehabilitated, and I think that he deserves a place in American art and will have and does have, actually, that place of 20th century artists who were doing something very interesting in their work. I think that even artists like John Curran today emerged out of that. And I spoke with a curator who had been at the Museum of Modern Art. So the Museum of Modern Art, as I said at the beginning, doesn't really know what to do with this painting. It's not like anything else they have. They stuck it in a hallway. It's, by the way, one of their most popular paintings. The postcard is the most popular postcard of all of their artworks there. But it's sort of a bizarre way that they handle it. There's no context. So I spoke with this lovely curator who had worked at MoMA and moved on to another large museum, and he said, in my dream, that painting would be at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or perhaps Philadelphia, where it would be contextualized. It would perhaps have a wing like Guernica, where there would be other works of art from people in the same time period, influences, perhaps Thomas Eakins, perhaps some of these others that I've shown you, so that people could really see where Wyeth fits in the world of American arts. And it's such a shame that at MoMA they don't do that, and that there's really, as I say, there just is not any way for a student of art to go in and learn much unless you read something about, where Wyeth was and is in the art world. I was sorry, I went off on a long tangent there.
Did you find it challenging to write about chronic pain and worsening pain?
To write about what?
Chronic and worsening pain.
What I really, a little. I did a little. But, Christina was so resolute. She was so, nobody pitied her. She didn't pity herself. And so someone once said to me, before Orphan Train, I wrote a book that was really hard to write. I'm proud of it. It's called Bird in Hand. But my character, something happens at the beginning, and she's depressed. And I think maybe it was my editor, actually, who said, when you put your character in a hole at the beginning of depression, it's very hard to climb out. And that was hard. Christina was so plucky and sort of dealt with it that I didn't have that same difficulty. What was really hard was writing about real people who existed, and particularly because a number of people in my novel are still alive today, and that was tough. And also the Wyeth Foundation is very scary, and they care a lot about Andrew Wyeth's reputation. I didn't change anything in the book, and luckily for me, unlike with some of his later work, there was no controversy about his involvement, but and his relationship with Christina was actually quite lovely. Like, he really did adore her, and she adored him as well. So I wasn't whitewashing anything in his relationship with her. He had very difficult relationships with some people, but not with her. So, and I think I give you a hint of that. But writing about people who really existed was tough, and I'm not sure, I don't think I'll ever do that again. In Orphan Train, I wrote about a real story, but I had characters that I had invented.
So, how did you get to, the characters? In other words, I know you did a lot of research, but you couldn't interview people who were dead.
Yeah.
Did you talk to their descendants? How did you get to to the core of their relationships so that you could write about, their dialogue and their past and their present and all of that.
Right. Well, so the best answer perhaps is that, as a novelist, that's sort of what you do. It's always I was trying to get under the surface of her relationships. But I also did interview a ton of people. So when I first started thinking about this, I took a tour of the Christina Olson house. And there was a chipper, lovely young tour guide who was 22, and she had fun stories that she was telling about the Olsons. It was very entertaining. I was taking notes, and someone asked me why I was taking notes, and I said I was maybe thinking about writing a novel. I wasn't sure. And this older woman, as I finished the tour, she sort of beckoned me over and said, she slipped me her card, and she said, "I have been giving tours here since the beginning. I know everything. If you really want to know, give me a call." And of course, I immediately called her, and we became huge friends. I visited her in Sarasota, where she goes in the winter, and I visited her in Maine, and we've done all kinds of things together. She introduced me to people. Another tour guide found out I was writing this book and also contacted me. She introduced me to Wyeth family members, Olson family members, whom I interviewed, all of whom I interviewed. This amazing woman named Joy, Joie, Willamette. I went to her nursing home in Maine. She's 91 years old. I walked in, and she said, "I am Vivian," first of all, who is from Orphan Train, which was very sweet. She said, "I am Vivian. I'm 91 years old, just like Vivian. I had a similar journey." But she had grown up as a girl coming to Maine and had been in the Olson house every summer and had spent all this time with Christina Olson when she was young, and she had been very intimidated by her, but she had lots of stories. It was really fun to talk to people who had been around her, because one of the things I found, I took all these notes, I tape recorded them, and then I transcribed them just to hear the kinds of stories that people told, and all of those kind of worked their way in some way or another into the book. And the two sources that became so dog-eared that I had to buy new versions of them were Richard Merriman's biography of Andrew Wyeth, which is so brilliant. A lot of it is about Christina Olson, oddly. He focused on that so much in the book. And Richard Merriman was good friends with Wyeth, and he pulled out of him all these incredible stories. So, the language that the stuff I was reading to you from Wyeth, that was all from the Merriman biography. He just got him to talk and talk and talk about his process, which was super helpful. And then the other book is, and I'll end with this because I know we're done, but Christina had a niece, so the daughter of one of her brothers, Sam, Jean Olson, Brooks is her name, and she wrote a slim volume, a biography of her aunt, that was published by Downey's Press, a small press in Maine. It's now long out of print, and it had all the quotidian details that I used in the book. So maybe in 2 sentences, she would tell a story, and then that for me would be the basis of a chapter, which was phenomenal. And so I really did try to adhere as much as possible. When you read this novel, most of the stories are true stories. So just as a coda, I met with Jean. I interviewed her after being obsessed with her book and buying a new one because it fell apart. And so I went to visit her when I'd finished this novel, and I said, "Listen, Jean, I just spoke to Downey's Press, and I also have friends at Islandport, another Maine press. They would love to put out your book again. And I'm going to be touring around the country talking about my book. I'll talk about your book, and I think once people read mine, they might be curious about reading yours, which you can't get anymore." And she said, "I can't be bothered." And I said, "But Jean, you actually don't have to do anything. I mean, you've written the book. I could write a little intro or not. This does not benefit me, just you. You'll get money. People will pay you." And she said, "Come back to me in 6 months. I can't be bothered to think about it now." So I called her in December, and she said, the answering machine said, I'm in Florida. I'm not giving you a forwarding number." on her machine. And maybe next summer I'll talk to you again. That's what the message said on her answering machine. So basically, my brother-in-law calls Maine the anti-commerce state. Like, there's, you try to buy a house and they're like, I changed my mind. I'm not selling my house after all. But I just thought it was so marvelous that, Christina Olson's niece has no interest whatsoever in, re-releasing her book, which is great. So if you can get a used copy, try to. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming.